Good evening and welcome to the December 2021 episode of We Got Planning News for You. Technically, I think that makes it our Christmas episode, although it seems far too early to start donning the tinsel. Welcome, everybody. As always, can I encourage you to make a charity donation in place of a registration fee? You know by now the charities we support include the NHS Combined Charities, Just Giving Page, Shelter and Brian May's Save Me Trust. But of course, feel free to donate to a charity of your choice if you prefer. And we're delighted this evening to welcome Kate Henderson. Kate, hello.
Hello, hi, lovely to see you all.
Very, very pleased you're able to join us. Kate, of course, is the Chief Executive of the National Housing Federation, and we're going to, once Chris arrives from finishing his closing submissions, Chris is going to do his interview with Kate in the second half of the show. In the meantime, Kate, the usual questions. Can you tell us where you're calling us from, what you've chosen as our theme this evening, and what are you drinking?
Yeah, sure. So I am in North London. I'm at home at the moment. I've been out and about, but I've just got back. My theme this evening is Cornwall, and it's great to see a Cornish flag behind Mary. I got home and I thought I had some Cornish gin, but I must have accidentally finished it. So instead, I have found a Cornish pale ale, very luckily, in the cupboard. So I'm having a pale ale this evening.
I must say, the first time the Cornwall flag featured, I think it was behind Paul on a few months ago, and I didn't know what the Cornwall flag was. I thought Paul was flying the ISIS flag. I thought that's a slightly strange candidate to be a sleeper cell, but there we are. On that note, Mary, I've got to go with you first. If you're the Cornwall fan extraordinaire, you'll be delighted with Kate's choice of theme.
Absolutely. And as she very smartly observed, I have brought my flag in from home to the office. Here I am sitting in the town legal office, and it's lovely to see you, Kate. Welcome to the show. And I have a special picture to show you of something I purchased in Cornwall last weekend. So if I could just call up Rob. Now, This is my new gin bottle that I'm going to be drinking over Christmas, and it comes from a farm, the Colwith Farm Distillery. And to be fair to them, they make both vodka and gin. And in fact, Avildor means potato in Cornish. So that's my tipple that I'm going to be looking forward to, that I thought I'd share with you. Thank you, Rob.
If it lasts.
Recommendation.
If it lasts till Christmas, it looks lovely, Mary.
Thank you.
Sasha, how are you?
I'm very well. I apart from the 4:30 wake up this morning to get to Shropshire and back, but I think I'm now in the right county. I'm in London, and I'm delighted Kate chose the Cornish theme. My mother was born in St Agnes, so I love Cornwall, and I spent my childhood there. And I've got a photo for you, me and Chris on a Cornish lane during when we were at Land's End. There is Chris. Oh, yeah. He's trying to remain incognito, but Chris and I in a Cornish lane. Yeah.
Cheers. Well, Paul, good to see you. I love your tie. I didn't know I'd have to bring sunglasses to.
Well, Dith Dar, Charlie, and Fatla Guinness, as they say in Cornwall, apparently. Good evening. How are you? Nice to see you, Kate. I've got a bit of a fail, I'm afraid. I've got some Cornish beer, and I've got some more Cornish beer. I just ran down for a bottle opener to the room service. I was sent this.
I
was about to say, you're going to give the best.
It doesn't work.
Your challenge by the end of the show is to open 2 bottles of beer with a shoehorn. Oh, don't! Ow!
He's actually going to give the best closing speech he's ever given in the morning after those beers.
Well, being equally as original as you, Paul, guess what I got? I got the one other Cornish beer that you didn't. I have actually managed to open it, however, not using a shoehorn. Good old Doom Bar. Charlie Banner here, Keating Chambers. And let's go straight into the case reports. And we've got, I think, probably for the first time, all of our cases this week are Secretary of State decisions. There's been a glut of decisions, mostly negative for the appellants. And Mary is going to kick off with the first of 2 London ones, the Tulip decision. Over to you, Mary.
Thank you very much. Indeed I am. And I'm going to just call upon young Rob for his assistance here. But my decision is, as you say, all about the Tulip. Now, this was a decision made by Christopher Pincher, of course, former guest on the show, Minister of State for Housing. and it relates to a 305-metre tower known as the Tulip for obvious reasons. And perhaps, Rob, you could show us, yes, thank you very much, one of the images. So this was a proposal designed by Fosters and Partners in the city by the cluster, as it's known as, and it was initially supported and approved by the City of London Corporation, but it was blocked by the mayor in 2019, in the summer of 2019, and it was appealed, interestingly enough, 3 days before the 6-month deadline, which I always think tells you something. The inspector was the impeccable David Nicholson, architect inspector. I'm going to share a secret. Only inspector I've kissed. I'm not going to describe the circumstances, but he conducted a virtual inquiry lasting over 6 weeks, which finished in December. He produced a 166-page report. And in my experience, this is a unique report. And perhaps Rob, you could now just put up page 15 of the inspector's examination report, because it begins with a picture and another example, page 20, if you'd be so kind, Rob. So this inspector's report is littered with plans and images, which to my mind is unique. I haven't seen one of such a thing as this before, but perhaps he's paving the way. I'm sure he is. Anyway, the issues here were all about the extent of harm to the significance of the Tower of London, a World Heritage Site, and there were various other conservation areas and listed buildings that were said to be affected. And the appeal was a many-handed affair. So we had Russell Harris calling Professor Taverner and Chris Mealy on behalf of the appellant. We had Neil Cameron supporting on behalf of the city, calling officers from the city. The opposition was led by Hereward Philpott, acting for the mayor, who called Nigel Parker Mills and Elizabeth Adams, and also Historic England were represented by the lovely Scott Linus, who called David English from Historic England. So there was an array of parties, all with slightly different cases on the spectrum of harm and the extent of the benefits. Welcome, Mr. Young, to the show. I detect him coming in. But just to cut to the chase, in the end, the inspector's recommendation was that the proposals be refused. He described the Tulip as a proposal which exuded extremes. Although it had honeyed detailing and exquisite presentation, the purpose, form, materials, and location had resulted in a design which he said would cause considerable harm to the significance of the Tower of London and further harm to other designated heritage assets. He was rather scathing about the sustainability of the overall proposal, whilst recognising the considerable efforts that had been made, and was of the view that the reinforced concrete lift shaft with a very high embodied energy represented an unsustainable life cycle, and that therefore the proposal was not of the highest architectural quality, because partly the design and secondly the poor lifetime sustainability. And he took the view that the economic benefits in the context of the city and in the context of all the other attractions in London, because it was basically a tourist attraction at the top, was limited, and that in the classic 196 exercise, the benefits fell, quotes, well short of outweighing the considerable harm to the moderate harm of the outstanding universal value of the Tower of London. And so for those reasons, he concluded the scheme wouldn't be consistent with the development plan and it ought to be refused. And the minister agreed with all of the inspector's recommendations and dismissed it. Thank you very much, Charlie.
Thanks, Mary. And next up, Sasha's going to tell us about another Secretary of State decision relating to Brighton Marina, with not dissimilar outcome or reasoning in many ways.
Yes, I think that I'm going to deal with Brighton Marina, which, as most of you will know, lots of us have seen it, is a pretty prominent site on the seafront of Brighton. And I think we're all in the industry trying to work out what's the approach of Gove to matters of design, etc., etc. And this was a decision that Brighton Marina, as most will know, started to be developed for housing. There was a scheme, I think, in 2006, which had planning permission, but the owners of the marina came forward with a bigger and what they considered better scheme for 1,000 apartments. And it was Rupert Warren represented the appellants, Angela Foster, the local authority. The other notable thing about the appearances was a retired inspector. Beware the retired inspector who turns up meekly and quietly to make representation and naturally has quite a seminal role. And most of us remember Robert Mellor. He appeared at this inquiry as a local resident. I once actually, I remember I've had the inspector who said he had the first ever hearing, and he turned up at an inquiry in 2009 and was astonished when we had 150 residents and 9 professional witnesses. He said that he was amazed at how hearings have evolved. Anyway, getting back to Brighton Marina, the point is we all want to know what the Secretary of State thinks beauty constitutes. And of course, all our clients are asking it. And in this case, it's quite clear the inspector takes the view that beauty requires a very strong consideration of what compliance with the development plan constitutes and local design guide. Brighton, at the late stage, adopted a local design guide, and the inspector took a very, very forensic approach to design and concluded overall that the proposal was harmful in terms of its design. And I think this is a really important decision because notwithstanding the operation of the tilted balance, Brighton had about a 4.3 HLS compliance. So the tilted balance was in play. And also, and I say this for all local authority officers who put in their proofs, moderate weight to affordable housing and moderate weight to the supply of market housing, please from now on note, the Secretary of State in this decision gives very significant weight to both. And this will obviously, I'm sure, Mary, Charlie, myself, Chris and Paul will all be referring to this decision as other members of the bar over the next 6 months. Very significant weight. And I know Kate will be almost jumping around with joy. Very significant weight. However, notwithstanding that, the inspector felt the harm to heritage assets, the harm because of design and harm to the living conditions of the future occupiers were all factors which outweighed the benefits, and thereby refusing it. So my takeaway is we are now in an era where the Secretary of State and his inspectors are all giving very considerable weight to design. Thank you, Charlie.
Thank you, Sasha. And next up, Paul. We're going to go a bit further north now, aren't we? And you're going to
go a lot further north. But before I do, can I thank Michelle Smith, who's given me the tip, which worked, which allowed me to remove the cat from this. Apparently, it's use the little metal bit in the door to the bathroom at the hotel and break it like that. I have learned something today, and it worked. Cheers, Michelle.
I still think you should have tried the shoehorn.
Yeah, well, my teeth didn't break. Long story. Right. So imagine yourself in a different universe, a universe without COVID. And had there been such a universe, then there would have been a mega inquiry. It would have been a mega inquiry which would have taken place last year, and it would have involved most of King's Chambers. It would have involved a series of logistics schemes, and it would have also involved Anjali and Sasha from Landmark turning up for representing the Parkside group, promoting one of the schemes, but everybody else was King's. It would have been a fantastic Beano in terms of a company. However, everything went online. So there were 4 large-scale logistics schemes that were considered on virtual inquiries by 2 inspectors, Messrs. Young and Sims, from late 2020, sequentially going into spring of 2021, and then followed by another one, which was considered by Mr. Inspector Mike Warden, who bizarrely, by one of life's coincidences I'm in front of today. All of them are Secretary of State's decisions. All of them are call-ins, with the exception of the one I was involved in, which was a refusal and an appeal at Haydock Park. So 2 of those decisions came out earlier on in the year. They involved sites at Symmetry Park and Wingates in Bolton, and those involved schemes in the Greenbelt for large-scale logistics and were granted by the Secretary of State. In relation to the others that have come out in the last couple of weeks, They've all all Secretary of State's decision, with the exception of Haydock Park, which was a Section 78 Secretary of State decision. They've been granted, save for the one I was involved in, which is Haydock Park, unfortunately. So the Parkside Colliery one, the one that Sasha was involved in, was granted together with the Parkside Link Road, notwithstanding opposition from a fairly articulate and vocal opposition group, as was Omega South, which is a site in St Helens close to Warrington, intended to assist Warrington in terms of their employment land. But these are all big boxes, big boxes in the Greenbelt, most of them identified as emerging allocations. Haydock Park was identified as safeguarded land in the emerging plan. In all of the decisions, they were all treated as separate and individual decisions and assessed. There was no real assessment of cumulative effect. There was no comparison undertaken in relation to any of them. However, the Secretary of State identified that, notwithstanding significant adverse impacts upon the Greenbelt, that the economic benefits, both local in terms of the district and regional, outweighed substantial harm in relation to Greenbelt, but in terms of openness, in some instances in relation to heritage, and granted consent for all save Haydock Park. And now this is not sour grapes. This is genuinely putting forward a bit of a difficulty with it, which is where you've got a whole series of schemes which are very similar on very similar issues with very similar policy issues. Chris and I were involved in two cases in Sandbach about 10 years ago, where the Secretary of State rejected both my scheme for Gladman's and Chris's scheme for Richborough. He ultimately consented for judgment on the Richborough scheme, and we succeeded in quashing our decision for Gladman ultimately in the Court of Appeal. But the Court of Appeal said, where you've got diametrically opposed views about schemes, where they raise very similar issues and they're granted very close together, you need to explain what's going on. And that's a bit of a lacuna in relation to the one that was dismissed. So dangle the sour grapes in relation to that. And whilst you're dangling the sour grapes in relation to that, you should also note that Sasha's case, which is great, it involved the most fantastic piece of heritage evidence, because the greatest king that ever ruled in these islands was, of course, King Oswald, King of Northumbria, who was defeated tragically by King Penda of Mercia in 642 at the Battle of Maserfield, which was said to have taken place near Warrington. Now, amazingly, the forensic skills of counsel for the applicant in the Parkside case managed to say, because there were no letters and because there was no plans, therefore there was no evidence that the battle took place anywhere near Warrington. And that's what's set out in the Secretary of State's decision. It took place in 642. There's 3 letters that have survived from the 7th century. Brilliant piece of advocacy, Sasha. Brilliant. Thank you, Charlie.
Thanks, Paul. I remembered that one. But nice one, Sasha. Well, I'm going to finish off the case reports dealing with the Westferry case. This was another decision of Chris Pincher, former guest of the show, as Mary said, the Minister for Rough Sleeping and Housing, on behalf of the Secretary of State, to dismiss Westferry Development Limited's appeal for a 1,524 dwelling residential-led mixed-use development at the Westferry Printwork sites. The development comprised, amongst the things, of 5 towers, including one of 31 stories above ground floor, one of 45 stories, so pretty big on any view. Now, this case is, of course, infamous, given the previous successful legal challenge, the decision of the previous Secretary of State, Robert Jenrick, to allow the appeal in circumstances which, let's say, in neutral language, gave rise to an appearance of bias. Now, following the High Court consent order quashing the original decision, the case went back for reconsideration. The inspector's report of David Prentice recommending refusal still stood, because it was only the Secretary of State's decision that was quashed. But a further inquiry was held despite that, and a further report written to consider potential material changes in circumstances since the first report, most notably new development plans at London level, borough level, and indeed neighbourhood plan level. And Inspector Prentice's second report again recommended refusal, and this time Minister Pincher on behalf of the Secretary of State agreed. Now, the main thrust of the decision was that the proposal would, principally due to the height, have a harmful impact on character and appearance of the area, and importantly, a range of designated heritage assets. The inspector and the Secretary of State thought that rather than a design-led approach, seeking to ensure the most appropriate form of development for the site. The proposal sought to maximise capacity without properly responding to the character of the place. That was the main thing they did for the scheme. There were other considerations too. Those are the main ones. Now, the local authority couldn't demonstrate a 5-year supply. 4.85 years was the figure identified by the inspector and accepted by the Secretary of State. But because the heritage harm wasn't outweighed by public benefits, there was a clear reason for refusal under the terms of paragraph 11D1 of the framework, and therefore the tilted balance at 11D2 was inapplicable. One didn't get to the tilted balance. Now, I'm just going to dwell on 3 aspects of the decision that are of broader significance. That I could spend hours talking about the decision, but the 3 that seem to me to be of potential general application to our viewers are the following. The 5-year housing and supply shortfall was described by the inspector and agreed by the minister to be small, that's 4.85 years, and not a significant factor in the overall balance, his words, only limited weight given to this consideration. Now, on the face of it, one might think, well, that's a bit troubling, not least in context of the Brighton decision, which suggested otherwise. But it must be remembered that this was in the context of the Tower Hamlets requirement being what was described as a very large requirement. Numerically, it was over 20,000 dwellings required in a 5-year period. And because of that scale, necessarily relied on tall buildings, and then necessarily would sort of ebb and flow as those buildings came on stream and otherwise. So it seems to me that though on the face of it, only limited weight to a 4.5-year supply might be something that be thrown at schemes in other parts of the country. I don't think that reasoning is applicable to 5-year supply shortfalls in non-urban authorities. And I think the very significant weight of the kind that Sasha talked about in the Brighton case is more likely to be applicable. Second point, the new NPPF policies on design equality were relied upon in the decision, as they were in the Tulip and the Brighton cases. Whilst they gave undoubtedly added impetus to the design objections, I don't think they really made a difference to the outcome. In fact, I'd venture to say ditto in relation to Brighton and Tulip as well. It seems to me that in all 3 cases, there were shortcomings identified with the design, which led to conflict with the development plan, and the framework design policies simply gave a bit of afterburner to what otherwise would still have been the same conclusion. So for now, I don't think these are illustrations of schemes where there would be different outcome was reached because of the new framework design policies. Finally, very little weight, the inspector's words adopted by the minister, was given to the SIL payment of around £43 million. The reasoning being that SIL is a legal requirement, not at a function of the scale of the appeal scheme. I'm not sure I completely follow that myself, because a requirement can still be a benefit. It's £43 million in the bank to deliver public benefits, which would not be in the bank absent the scheme, but who am I to gainsay? Experienced inspector and Secretary of State. So that is the position. SIL receipts, very limited weight. So those are 3 aspects of the case that I think are of particular importance. With that, I'm going to pass over to Chris, and we're going to start our interview with Kate, which I'm very much looking forward to. So over to you. Can I just say, please do, anybody put any questions you might have for Kate in the Q&A box, and we'll try and answer at least one of those at the end.
Thank you very much, Charlie. I hope everybody can hear me okay. I'm in Malmesbury Town Hall. We've just finished. I was slightly late, forgive me for that. Just finishing closing submissions in a 2-week case here in the lovely Cotswolds. And I just have to say, Paul, I'm drinking this, okay? And I couldn't get the top off. And so my planning consultant, Jeff Richards, didn't use the door like Michelle. He used a knife from the kitchen in the canteen of the town hall and wedged it off that way. So we're learning a lot today, aren't we, about how to open beer.
Jeff's really, really hard then.
Yeah, he was ripping it off. And had my inquiry with Shona Davis and Mike Curtin and lots of people who watch the show, and they'll have to listen to the podcast when they get home. But and I agree with you, Paul, about Foxland and what was said in Foxland about deciding all these cases together. Only you could be so polite about a situation where the other schemes are successful. We all know what a fabulous advocate you are. So, but well done for telling that story. Okay, now the interview, and to turn to Kate, you've been incredibly patient. Thank you very much indeed. We are absolutely delighted to have you on the show and talking to us about the fabulous work that housing associations do. You are the Chief Executive of the National Housing Federation, a group that everybody knows about. And what I wanted to do is just start with a little bit about you before we turn to the Federation, and just to ask about your fantastic career and how your career has progressed to this amazing position you've now reached as the Chief Executive.
Oh, well, thanks, Chris, and it's great to be here. First off, I should have explained why Cornwall was my theme, and I failed to do so. So starting at the very beginning, so I was born in Penzance, which is the very end of the train line, for those of you who don't know that bit of the country. And I actually went to school in the last school, so Cape Cornwall Comprehensive, the last school before you hit Land's End, so absolute end of the universe. Beautiful place to grow up, but when you get to your teenage years, you're desperate for a bit of urban life, so moved to London for university. However, when I was growing up in Cornwall, I'd never heard of planning or any of these conversations. I did do, though, very geekily, a million years ago, my GCSE geography project on the impact of an out-of-town shopping centre just outside Penzance on the future of the high street, which actually, in my later years at TCPA, it all came back to me around planning. But just a bit about my kind of journey to where I am now. So I moved to London, I studied geology, which I absolutely loved, and I still love the outdoors and rocks, but I decided I wanted to do something that was a bit more applied to policy and politics. So then, having done geology at UCL, went to Imperial and did a master's in environmental technology and specialised in energy policy. And that led me kind of first job into doing some consultancy on wind farm planning applications, which are hugely controversial. This is all pre-2010. So 2010 obviously is a moratorium on onshore wind. So prior to that, a lot of the TAN8 stuff in Wales, for anyone who's involved in that, but also some in the Midlands, and also some work around biofuels. So quite a lot of work around getting renewable projects off the ground, engaging communities, but also engaging with national government. And that took me into the Town and Country Planning Association, where I first joined as an energy policy and communications role, and then a strategy role. And then in 2010, the then Chief Executive, Gideon Amos, went over to the Planning Inspectorate, and I became the interim Chief Executive, which I did for 6 months before applying for the permanent role. So I was at the TCPA for about 11 years, but running it for about 8, which was an amazing time, a big period of change, because I started there in 27. So we had the last of the Labour years, all of the Ecotown stuff, all of the housing market renewal, growth points, all of that stuff. And then 2020, big shift in direction. So I was at the TCPA through lots of things going and lots of things coming in terms of the MPPF and the like. And then I joined the National Housing Federation 3 years ago, which is the trade association for housing associations. So that's me in a nutshell.
Yes, but I happen to know, you're being very modest about it, that your interview for your current job was a 7-stage process. Is that right?
It was a 7-stage process that involved... Wow. It involved some of the competency testing stuff that you might have been through, which, as someone who's got 2 science degrees, multiple choice questions on algebra, all of a sudden I was like, I can't remember how to do this, and you're timed. So there was some of that stuff. There were interviews with psychologists. There were media interviews as well. Can you stand up to scrutiny? How would you perform if you're on the Today programme or Newsnight, which they really wanted to know what they were getting. And, in order to ensure that they had someone fronting up the sector who was able to articulate complicated stuff and handle a lot of pressure.
Yeah, well, I mean, that I can see why they would do that, though, because what does your job involve? We see you on LinkedIn. I do quite a bit. You can outcompete me there, I think. And, what does your job involve as Chief Executive? How is your time divided?
Yeah, sure. So a lot of my job and the primary purpose of the National Housing Federation is around shaping the policy environment. So being able to create the right conditions for our members to be able to deliver their social purpose, which is being good landlords, providing homes for people on lower incomes whose housing needs are not met by the market. So a lot of my job is kind of advocacy work. It's engagement with government. So that might be on government commissions. So I'm on the rough sleeping advisory panel. I'm on an expert challenge panel for the social housing white paper. I also do things like I'm on a group that's set up by the Domestic Abuse Commissioner, looking at interventions on perpetrators. Again, I'm not an expert on domestic abuse, but the housing association sector has a hugely important role of being part of the solution. So part of my role is that kind of stuff. Part of it's lots of meeting MPs, but it's also being out and about understanding what housing associations do, the challenges they're facing, meeting residents, meeting frontline staff, but also meeting exec teams and boards, which is why you see me out and about across the country a lot, seeing what our members do. And I think for those of you who don't know the sector, the National Housing Federation represents 800 members. We are very, very involved in housing supply. So 1 in 4 of new homes would be developed by a housing association, might be through a Section 106. We might not actually be building it ourselves, but it will be taken on by a housing association. But we also do just a huge range of stuff. And some of our members are very big and some are very small and specialist. And we're in pretty much every part of the country. So we do things like accommodation for care leavers, accommodation, supported housing for adults with learning disabilities, homeless hostels, refuges for women and families fleeing domestic abuse. We do lots of extra care accommodation for older people. And then we do things like shared ownership, so helping people onto the housing ladder. We might be master developers. We might just do a tiny bit of a Section 106. And we might, one member might be doing an infill site of 3 homes, and that's a big deal for them. Another member might be delivering a whole new kind of urban extension, new community. So a real range of activities. There isn't really a typical week. It does take me to all over the country. And I think one of the things that's great about the job is that every day is quite different. So you could be in a homeless hostel in the morning and doing a select committee in the afternoon.
It's very interested in you talking to ministers, and obviously you've got a good dialogue with them there. But do they listen? I mean, do you find government officials and ministers listen, or do they just kind of, they just listen or give the impression they're listening and then it all goes in one ear and out the other?
So I think the relationship with ministers, and with officials, it takes time to earn trust. It's actually all about, relating to people on a human level, understanding where you've got shared agendas, understanding where you've got shared challenges. And I think, trust takes time to build, but it's absolutely, that is part of the job. In terms of whether ministers are listening, I think during the course of the pandemic, whilst it was remote, the engagement we had with the government and with ministers was quite remarkable. So that was everything from, how do we coordinate PPE into care settings that housing associations are running and managing? How do we ensure, as much as possible, construction can keep going in the height of lockdown? How do we get frontline workers on the list of, of workers whose kids can still be eligible to go into school? So it's a real mix of things. We're really pleased to get a very early meeting in with Michael Gove in his second week in the role, which was great. And, he's the Secretary of State. It very much seems like he is listening. He has a huge job on his hand. He's tasked with levelling up, defining what it means, and then delivering on it. He's tasked with the building safety crisis, and he's also tasked with the union. So these are 3 very, very significant kind of parts of his role. So we have kind of the formal one-to-one engagement, but we also, I mentioned some of those panels that I'm on, like the Rough Sleeping Advisory Panel, that's chaired by a minister. We recently did a roundtable on rural affordable housing, and you'd have a DEFRA minister and a DULUC minister, jointly chairing that. So there's the really formal, and then there's the less formal, and then there's the even more informal, where you might be at an event from a panel, you might have a coffee with them, that kind of thing.
Can I ask about your views as an organisation about the government's focus on urban lands? Lots more housing going into cities, the 20 biggest cities, and a lot of PRS, private rented sector housing. I mean, what's your view? Because planning policy is definitely pushing housing down those routes.
So we always get stuck in this very, binary argument about, whether brownfield's good and greenfield's bad. And actually, it's much more nuanced than that. I mean, it would be wonderful if every local authority in the country had a plan that was based on actual housing need and was based on identifying the most sustainable locations for growth. So I do think it is right that we are looking at the best use of existing land. I think a focus on brownfield is absolutely right in the most sustainable locations. But the economics, the viability has got to stack up. So it's great that with the spending review, we had some money for brownfield funding, fantastic, 1.8 billion. But actually, are we going to combine that with decarbonisation funding, with actually some regeneration funding, with having more flexibility with the Affordable Homes Programme, with, there's so many different funding pots in Homes England, but are we going to use that to make sure that those sites can actually come forward in a viable way to deliver a sustainable community? So I think, the intention is the right one. Let's use existing land, let's reinvigorate local economies, particularly ones who've perhaps lost their strong economic purpose and they need to reinvent them, and actually having a good housing mix there would help. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't also look at greenfield land. And when we are looking at greenfield land, let's do it in a really sustainable way. So if we're doing brownfield land, let's enhance the biodiversity, let's make sure that we're planning in new green spaces in that brownfield land. And if we are going to use greenfield land, which inevitably we do need to use some greenfield land to meet housing need, let's do it in those locations where there is high housing need, but we can do it in a way that's sustainable. So we get the sustainable transport in, we get in the good local schools, we have the good housing mix, all of the stuff that we know we can do, but we don't necessarily do if everything just goes on through on a piecemeal appeal way, because we don't have a local authority plan in place that does these big sites.
Your members must be observing, though, a drop in the amount of affordable housing being delivered through a focus on brownfield, because most brownfield sites can't support affordable, can they? I mean, government money being thrown at this is one thing, but actually genuine cross-subsidisation, that is very much a greenfield delivery mechanism, isn't it?
So cross-subsidy also only gets you so far in meeting genuine housing need and delivering social rented homes and other forms of affordable housing. So cross-subsidy has worked, over many years, but it is absolutely not the fundamental solution to delivering on housing need in this country. The way to do that is partnership, it's through grants, it's through investment, it's through taking a longer term view of, our housing benefit bill is huge. Actually, longer term, if we want to bring that down, it means upfront capital funding in social housing. So I don't think we can rely on cross-subsidy. And I think with those brownfield sites, it does become much harder, but it would be, we would be really letting down those communities if we don't get some affordable housing in those places too, because they need it too.
Can I ask you about right to buy and what effect that is having? Because that is surely eroding. We hear a lot about eroding the amount of social rented that's available.
Yeah, we have such huge housing need in this country, and in particular for social rented homes, which are typically 50% of a market rent. In places like London, it could be 30% of a market rent. It might be higher, 60 or 70 in some of our Midlands and Northern towns, but it is always less than a market rent. Now, again, when we talk about right to buy, we get into this argument that sort of says, people should have the ability to move from different tenures, and that actually some people don't want to be in social housing for life. That's totally fine. But losing social homes as a result of it and not building up additional net social housing shouldn't be the outcome. So I think what we need to focus on isn't necessarily right to buy at this point in time. It's much more, and of course it's leading to a net loss of social housing. What we need to focus on is how we deliver many, many more affordable homes, and of those different tenures. So it won't just be social rent, but we need a lot more social rent, but also things like shared ownership as well.
Do you, where do you see the whole climate change agenda affecting housing associations? Because we've just had COP26. There must be direct impact on housing associations arising out of that.
So I feel really excited about the climate agenda. Now, you can look at it in two ways. You can look at it in the doom way of this is the biggest challenge facing the planet, facing society, facing our economy. Or you can say we have a massive opportunity here to invest in places to make it better and more sustainable for future generations. And I think as housing associations, it's a responsibility, but it's also something that's quite empowering. It's going to help us with recruitment of the next generation of people who come into this sector. There are lots of benefits for tackling the climate crisis as a social landlord. We are improving the quality of our stock. We're making our homes healthier. We should be making them cheaper to live in. There's some challenges at the moment in terms of energy prices, but ultimately get the insulation right. Your energy bill should come down, whatever your energy source is coming into the property. There's job creation, there's supply chains. And as social landlords, because we're not just thinking about the individual home, we can think about a flat, a block, a street, a neighbourhood, a whole community. And it should open up real economies of scale of rolling out solutions. I also think with the climate stuff, it's quite different in terms of owner occupiers or private renters, because the incentives are totally different. Like, it's really, if you own your own home, do you really want to replace your boiler right now? Probably just hold on a bit more. It's a massive expense. The messaging from government at the moment is quite scary. As a social landlord, if we can get the communication right with residents, of course it will be disruptive, but with residents, and say, let's work together on what's going to make your home cheaper to live in, and we're going to do it with you. But government, you're going to need to fund some of this. Then I think it's a big opportunity. The government, we got a win in the spending review. So they've just announced another 800 million for the social housing decarbonisation fund over the next 3 years. It's a start. This is a 30-year programme. It's going to cost billions, but this is a really important kind of start of, okay, given that we're housing associations, we've got pretty much every type of housing. Let's work out what works with different housing typologies in different places. Let's work out what doesn't work as well, and not roll that out everywhere, and learn from our mistakes pretty quickly. From a planning perspective, I think we're going to have to do quite a lot of work with our local authority partners, and probably with government as well, on how do we speed this up? What are the changes that are going to be needed? What are the best solutions in conservation areas? Those kind of things as well. So we're all working together on this, rather than spending a long time arguing about that stuff.
Okay, well, I'm going to throw it over to Mary now. And Mary, your question.
Thank you very much, Chris. Kate, currently, how much affordable housing is delivered via Section 106s rather than grant-funded schemes, which you mentioned? And how concerned are your members about the potential loss of affordable housing through 106 and it being left to a new infrastructure levy, as has been suggested by government?
So that's a great question, and one that we're talking a lot about in the sector. So housing associations responsible for around 1 in 4 new homes that are built in this country. Around half of those, so say we deliver 200,000, the numbers go up and down. So we deliver around 50,000, and again, it's up or down a bit from that. Half of those are delivered by grant funding, and half of those are delivered through Section 106. I think for the last year, it was about 48%. So it's really, really significant. And in rural areas, it might be as high as 65-70% of homes are delivered through Section 106s. So one of the things, actually, when the planning white paper was announced, is they also had the shorter term measures, and one was a proposal to change the threshold of Section 106s from 10 homes to 40 or 50 homes. We engaged very constructively with government on that, and we were really pleased that they listened, because of the impact, particularly on rural communities, and did not bring that proposal forward at that time. And we're really hoping that they listen around kind of the impact of Section 106. So I completely get the idea of having an infrastructure levy to give some certainty and some clarity and some uniformity of using the planning system and how it's going to work. But the challenge with how it's and again, we need a bit more detail on this to really comment on it. But the way that the infrastructure levy has been articulated is it's a levy paid from the developer to the local authority. Now, we don't know if that money to the local authority is ring-fenced. We also don't know, with that model, how you deliver a mixed community. And whilst we are absolutely 100% pro delivering lots and lots of social housing, we do want mixed communities as well. We want communities that have all housing types and tenures in them, because they are the most successful places. And I don't see, if it was a community, some that just goes to the local authority, you wouldn't want the affordable housing all being, on the edge of town where there was a former petrol station or that kind of thing. You want to integrate it into the new place. So that, it's not impossible for that to be worked through, but those are some big issues for us. There's also kind of a fundamental in that model is, where's the housing association? Because if it's, maybe the housing association is the actual developer, the master developer, in which case I would say we want to be exempt from the levy because we would be delivering affordable housing. So there's some big challenges with what's being proposed. And I think our view is it's better to, Section 106 is not perfect. I'm sure everybody tuning in will say Section 106 isn't perfect, but it does work. It does deliver a lot of affordable housing. Let's improve it, make it better. Let's support local authorities, in terms of getting the best possible deal they can out of Section 106 and improve it rather than scrap it altogether.
Agreed, Kate. Good luck with that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Paul, you got a question?
I do, Kate, and I'm going to use what happens with Boris on the COVID stand, and the journalists always ask 2 questions, so I'm going to cheat and ask 2 questions. The first of which is, Michael Gove says he's in listening mode. So if you could choose one reform that he could bring forward which would improve your sector, what would it be? And then second, to Chris Whitty, Ian Orcock has asked a question about co-living and about whether co-living involving young people is a sort of innovative scheme which would help in relation to reducing the housing problem, and what your thoughts are about that. So 2 questions. Sorry about that.
No, brilliant. So, I mean, in terms of, on the pause on planning reform and what we'd ask of Michael Gove, on the planning front, it's pretty simple. We want local authorities to be well resourced. We want them to attract good talent, have capacity, and have an equal voice at the table so that they can do their local plans and then be more visionary, but also be able to negotiate and get a good deal for their communities so that we get better outcomes. And if we had strong local plans because we had that capacity in our local authorities, I think we would deliver more affordable housing. The question about co-living, I think, is a really interesting one. I think there's some really, really lovely examples in Scandinavia of happy, healthy places, and it works for the very young children, and it works for the older people as well, in terms of actually having the joy of life and of being around people that you wouldn't necessarily have the opportunity to interact with, particularly if you're older. And there's been lots of isolation and loneliness, particularly during the pandemic. I also think there's a lot to be said around the right type of housing in the right area. So there's quite a lot of, and there has been, often on these debates around downsizing and how there are, lots of people who are in houses that are too big for them. But why would you move if you didn't have a great local alternative? It's your family home. It's your place. It's your community. If you want people to move, there needs to be a beautiful, nice, smaller local alternative that is affordable for you, that might release some equity for you, but also is still in the same place. You might, still probably want to have an extra bedroom so your kids can come and stay, or grandkids. And I think if we were able to talk about housing need and to have those assessments of actually what people actually want, and that probably does mean in some areas where they don't want growth, and it's the people who are objecting to growth in these big houses that perhaps don't need all of that space, actually having them about what do you want, and then freeing up some of that family housing. And that's housing of all tenures, I think.
Thank you. That's great. Thank you.
Right, Charlie, do you have a question?
Thanks, Chris, and hi, Kate. This really fascinating discussion. I said I'd ask an audience question. There's been so many. Apologies to those whose brilliant questions I can't pose to you, but the one I'm going to is from Mark, and he says, apart from saying keep up the great work, which all of us would endorse, he says, do you think the housing associations, because of their long-term interest in housing stock and interest in their tenants' lives, including fuel poverty, do you think that they're in a particularly good place to advance low and zero carbon housing?
So I'd love to say that everybody is ready and at the forefront of doing that. But I think housing associations are at different stages of this journey to net zero. I think we will all get there. And I think there's a lot of learning and a lot of collaboration that needs to happen. But I think we are really, really well placed to progress that. I should also say that there are plenty of other challenges on our plate at the moment as well. It's we really want to be ambitious about net zero, but we are also dealing, when it comes to inflation, workforce issues at the moment are in doing interesting things, maybe in terms of supply, parts, materials, that will be short term. But in terms of workforce gaps, particularly on construction and repairs, some of the trades at the moment, that might be longer term and cost baked in. So we're just working through that. And of course, our top priority at the moment is building safety. The last 4 years, we have been working incredibly hard of assessing all buildings, particularly high buildings, first off above 80 metres and first off with ACM, but now working through other materials and other heights. And so I think for those housing associations that are particularly impacted from that it's completely non-negotiable. Building safety comes first. They might be slower on the journey to net zero. However, the ideal would be to be thinking about them at the same time, because if you're taking off the the material that's on the outside of the building. If you're going in and doing intrusive work, it'd be great to also improve the sustainability at the same time. But the ability to do that within the funding constraints and the programs available makes that a bit challenging. But that would be the ideal. But the answer to the question is loads of potential on the journey to net zero in the sector, but we're at different stages with different members because of those different challenges.
Thank you.
Thanks, Charlie. Sasha, your question.
Thank you very much, Chris. Kate, yesterday when we were talking, having our preview, you mentioned that your estimate of the national need for affordable housing is around 100,000 units a year. And your estimate was deliveries about 6,000. So there's a huge gap. Obviously, it doesn't take, even my rudimentary maths gets to the scale of the gap. I mean, what do you do about members? I mean, I put a proposition to you that in a lot of authorities, the members, unlike in the past when they had the responsibility for provision of council housing, that most members don't take the provision of affordable housing seriously, frankly. I know it's a sweeping criticism, but I make it. Is that a criticism you agree with? And if you do, what can we do to get members buy-in to provide more affordable housing?
So it's not a new challenge, the challenge you highlight, but it is a real one that we haven't been taking the responsibility nationally, at the national political level or at a local political level, and this isn't everywhere, but in many places, about our civic responsibility to provide safe, secure, affordable housing for everybody in society. And there are people in society, there are a lot of people in society who the market won't meet their needs. So yeah, that figure of, I think it's, we need to build a lot more, whether it's 90,000 or 100,000 a year of social rent. That's a huge number compared, and that's each year, every year for a decade to meet housing need. And we're bumbling along at 5,000 or 6,000. So I think in terms of elected members, I think many of them do take this responsibility seriously, but don't feel like they've got the tools. They actually have more tools available to them than they potentially think. So, having really good housing need assessments and getting your viability arguments right through planning. But there is also something about national leadership. And I do think with the new Secretary of State, we have a Secretary of State who is more supportive of social housing than perhaps we've had in previous years over the past decade. We have an affordable homes programme, where the previous programme was very, very much geared towards affordable home ownership through shared ownership. This one is split half and half, with social rent in there and supported housing in there. And I think with elected members, it's a bit like, I don't know if any of you have dealt with planning inquiries where there's lots of objections towards housing for older people, because they think all of these old people are going to move to the area and put loads of pressure on local services. And it's not, it's like, it's them. They're the old people. It's their community. It's not loads of people flocking in because the accommodation's available. It's meeting local housing needs. So I think one of the things we need to do is encourage different voices to be elected to councils to represent, those different issues. And that's where I think there's a bit of hope actually nationally as well, in that we have a very different political landscape to 2 years ago. So when the election happened in 2019 and all of those seats went from red to blue across the red wall, those constituencies have much higher proportions of social housing and of voters who voted Conservative for the first time, who have a very different view towards social housing. So I'm hoping that also will help shift the balance as well.
That's really interesting. We spend a lot of our time, all five of us, talking about the 5-year land supply for market houses. What about a 5-year land supply for affordable housing, set on a figure where local authorities have to meet it, and if they don't, there are penalties or incentives at least for that? Well, what about that?
I'd vote for that, and I think the more you can incentivize it and encourage it being around, this is for your community, this is for your young people, this is for your teaching assistants, this is for your nurses, this is for the people who are building your houses, running your buses, working in your shops. This is about ensuring our communities thrive. And I think we are. I mean, I've been in some really interesting conversations actually in local kind of parish areas where those conversations are starting to switch around a bit. But having a 5-year land supply on affordable housing would be brilliant.
Okay. The only thing I want to ask you, and I think I have to really say this, is what advice would you give to young women looking at somebody like you who've reached chief executive level of an enormous organisation? What advice would you give them?
Oh, so, you know, I am certainly not an expert in leadership at all, but I think a couple of tips. I think one is about being brave and taking risks. So I think, you know, there is never a perfect time to move into that next step of your career. And quite often we hold ourselves back. So when I was approached about this job, I had an 18-month-old and a preschooler he'd just turned 4. And I was like, could I possibly take on a role like this with children that young? Is this the right time? The answer is no, it wasn't the right time, but it was the right time. And somehow, by putting myself forward and going through the process, at each step of the process, I was like, I think I can do this job. I don't know if I can be a good parent at the same time, but I can do the job. And actually, on that front, it's about giving yourself a break. So sometimes I'm a good parent. Sometimes I'm really good at my job. Sometimes I'm less good at my job, but I'm a better parent, and kind of cutting yourself a bit of slack with that. I guess also it's around being visible, like putting yourself forward for stuff. So the reason the board at the TCPA even considered me is because I was always saying, can I just observe a board meeting? Or I don't mind speaking at that event. I mean, you know, each one of those things was putting myself outside of my comfort zone. But actually, each time I did it, I was like, okay, that wasn't so bad. And it was actually quite fun and exciting. And I've learned from that. And then I guess stuff I've learned a bit more as I've got a bit older. So I would have never mentioned my kids on something like this previously. I'd have pretended I didn't have young children. I'm actually amazed they haven't barged into the room whilst doing a session. They've come home from school. They're being so quiet downstairs. I've even heard them outside the door. But previously, I would never have mentioned my children. And actually, it's completely cool that you're a parent and you have a job and you have a life. And it means you bring your, you know, different perspectives to work. And I think that that's a great thing. And we've kind of normalized that a bit more through the pandemic. That's a good thing. And then just 2 more things. One is around resilience. Like, these jobs are high stakes, really stressful. Sometimes you have no sleep. Sometimes you're dealing with stuff that really, really matters. And you've got to be resilient in that. You're not going to get everything right. You're not going to get every job application that you apply for either, and you have to keep going with that, and that's okay too. So resilience and perspective kind of help you have resilience. And then last but not least is kindness, which I think is massively underrated. But I remember the people who I've worked with who've been kind to me, whether that's been people who've been junior to me or whether it's been board members who've given me a shot. But I think as a woman in a visible leadership role, it's really important that I support and I'm kind to other people who want to go on this journey. And I think for all of you, you're, you know, very established in your careers, actually, you know, role modeling behaviors and being kind to the people that you work with and that you come into contact with goes a huge way in boosting people on that journey. And I would encourage lots of women, go for it.
I absolutely love that last answer. And you are just very obviously naturally kind. Thank you very much indeed. We've got lots of other questions. We're going to send them on to you because people would like to get answers. And then I hand back to you, Charlie. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. And can I extend my thanks, Kate? I mean, what a fascinating, wide-ranging and inspirational discussion. So you've been fantastic guests. We're hugely welcome. Well, that's it for this week. We'll be back on the first Thursday in January. Goodness knows where we'll all be then, probably in lockdown.
No. Be optimistic. Be optimistic.
My booster tomorrow. So have a great Christmas and a happy New Year. You're the first people, dear viewers, I've wished that this year. Have a blast, and we'll see you in January for another year's worth of We Got Planning News for you. Thank you for sticking with us, and cheers. Good night. Thanks again.
Thank you. Good night.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Well done, Kate. Excellent.
Thank you.